Okay. Hey everyone, how are you? Hope you're enjoying the beginning of fall here. So let's talk about homework number 2. 1 second, I think we lost. Yeah, all right. So yeah, in general, there weren't any big problems. There were maybe some small things that I think could have been improved. I try to note these on your homeworks, but if you have any additional questions about it, you can certainly come talk to me. Just a few things. When you're defining your variable, you got to be really careful, right? You want to make sure that you define everything about the variable, including have a clear citation, which a few of you did not have a clear citation for where you were getting your data. You want to talk about whether it's a variable that's averaged over the period or just measured at the end of the period, right? I think that was maybe something that a few of you were not completely clear about. When talking about variables, many of your variables had trend in it, okay? And so as we're going to talk about later this afternoon, dealing with trend is really important in financial data because if, for instance, if your data has trend in it and you're comparing it to another variable that has trend in it, it can look like they're both related even if they're not, right? Because their trends are going up. It looks like they're related, but they're not, all right? And so we'll talk about how you can deal with trend this afternoon, but that I think was an issue that a lot of you will have to deal with, right? Because a lot of you have data trends. In terms of whether the variable is smooth or volatile, that's why we have standard deviation, right? You cannot just eyeball data and say, oh, that looks smooth or that looks volatile, right? You have to look at the standard deviation, right? So eyeballing it is not going to help. For those of you, most of you have a lot of data, right? So what happens if you put a lot of data in a graph for a long period of time? It's all going to get smushed together and it's going to look smooth, right? So most of you said, yeah, sure, my data looks smooth. Well, that's because you have all your data smushed together in a small graph. What happens if you just looked at a 3-year period, for instance? You see a lot more variability, right? And so these are the kind of things you have to be careful about, right? You have to use your data to answer the questions, not just kind of eyeball stuff, because your eyes can be deceiving, as we'll see some examples of that this afternoon, all right? So make sure you look at that standard deviation, right? Look at that standard deviation and try to think about whether it's high or whether it's low. I think the other thing that I would say about this is that some of you just need to do some background research on your data, right? So in the last part here, asking, well, where have you seen big fluctuations in your data? Some of you said, yeah, well, things happened and, I bet it was this. No, I mean, you got to learn about your data, right? Part of understanding your data is not just getting the data, it's actually learning a little bit about the history of it, right? So, if you pick just, for instance, inflation, well, you'll see that there's big fluctuations in the inflation rate over time. You got to understand what were the context of that, right? Why was inflation so high in the 70s? Why did it fall so significantly during the 80s? Why has inflation been relatively low here the last 15 years, right? You have to do a little bit of history research on this, right? And so I think for many of you that was kind of thin, right? Like some of you you might have known 1 or 2 things that happened with your data, but I think you want to get more familiar with your data over time so that you really understand what's going on, all right? But in general, I think we did pretty good where we got our data together. And so this afternoon, we'll do our econometrics review, and also I will distribute homework number 3. And so you're really going to be using this data that you've collected. And the next step is I want you to figure out whether your data is pro-cyclical or counter-cyclical, right? So basically, what's this relationship with GDP? So I'm going to ask you to collect some GDP data and then do a little bit of regression analysis, okay? And so, as I said, we'll talk about that this afternoon. For many of you, for all of you, this should be somewhat review, but chances are you haven't seen it very much. So it's kind of a chance for us to go back and talk about it. And then we can also talk more about homework number 3 as it goes along, right? But definitely homework number 3 is going to be building on what you've done here in homework number 2. Okay, so anybody else have any questions about homework number 2? If you do, you can come see me and I can try to help you with that. Okay, so like I said, today we really have 2 things that we want to talk about. I don't think this is going to be a super long day, which is good because we've been been a lot of lecture here the last, particularly yesterday, felt like we were doing a lot of lecturing. So this morning we want to talk about sovereign debt and sovereign debt crises, okay? That will be our main topic this morning. And then this afternoon, we'll come back and we'll talk about econometrics and do a econometrics review, and that will probably take us about an hour or so, okay? So that's the agenda. So let's talk about sovereign debt and sovereign debt crises. Sovereign debt crises. Okay. When we talk about sovereign debt, we're really talking about government debt. All right, in any economy, government debt is a crucial financial asset, all right? In many ways, these are really kind of the first marketable financial assets that were traded broadly across the world was government debt, right? And government debt serves a lot of useful services. Right? Government debt is a very useful way for people to save. So maybe not most of us in this room, but most Americans are owners of government debt in one way, shape, or form, right? Because it's a very important way to save. It's a benchmark interest rate. All right, we've often talked about the interest rate on treasury bonds, or particularly treasury bills, as risk-free. So it's kind of a benchmark, right? Other interest rates are are benchmarked off of this, right? They move in relation to what treasury interest rates move. And then, of course, government debt is really important because it allows the government to smooth taxes and spending. Right? So just think about what's happened here in the US over the last 6 months. We have this big economic slowdown, tax collections go down, but yet spending needs go up. So what do? We borrow, right? This would be, all economists would say this would be an appropriate time to borrow, right? When the economy slows down, tax revenues fall, spending needs increase. How do we make up the shortcoming? Well, we borrow, right? If we didn't have that ability to borrow, we couldn't spend more and we'd have to raise taxes during bad times, right? In other words, we have to make things worse in many ways if we didn't have the ability to borrow money. And so having functioning government bond markets is crucial, right? It's just crucial. It's crucial to the working of the financial system, to the overall economy, to our political system, right? But of course, there's an interesting problem, right? And the problem is, why do governments have to pay it back? And we'll ask this question here, because in theory, the government's the government. They could decide not to pay it back. This is true whether the government's selling these bonds to its citizens, or this is, in some sense, particularly true if the government's selling these bonds to foreigners, right? What's the mechanism by which governments have to pay this back, right? We'll have to talk about that. But often what happens is that governments do not pay the money back for one reason or another. And that is, to some extent, what a sovereign debt crisis is. Okay. A sovereign debt crisis, get a better pen here. what is a sovereign debt crisis? I think the easiest way to explain it is it's a sudden stop in a government's ability to roll over its debt. So in some sense, in many sense, this is very much like a banking crisis. As we talked about yesterday, what's a banking crisis? Banks can't roll over their debt, right? They cannot, banks need to continually be borrowing, right? Because they borrow short term. So when they can no longer roll over that borrowing, when they can no longer roll over that short-term debt, they're in trouble. Same for governments. Governments have to continually be borrowing. What happens when they can't do that anymore? When the market says we're not going to buy any more of your bonds? Well, that's a sudden stop, right? And what that does is then, well, triggers a direct debt crisis, right? It basically means the government can't borrow enough money. So how are they going to spend? Right? How are they going to meet their spending needs? How are they going to deal with it? And we'll kind of talk about all these things. Right? We'll kind of talk about all these things. Before we get into an actual debt crisis, though, it's really important to make a distinction between two different types of sovereign debt. Domestic debt. What's domestic debt?
Is it that you have to pay back to your own citizens?
It could be, but I think there's something more important about domestic debt. What is domestic debt? What makes it domestic? It's not who holds it. No. Anybody do the readings? What's domestic debt? It's not who holds it, it's what currency it's denominated in, right? So domestic debt is denominated in domestic currency. So almost all US debt is domestic debt because it's denominated in US dollars. It doesn't make any difference if a foreigner holds it or not. It's denominated in domestic dollars. However, in general, who holds domestic debt? Well, domestic citizens, right? In general, that tends to be the case. So it's typically held by domestic citizens, but it doesn't have to be. Now, back to this question, why do governments have to pay it back? Well, why do governments pay back their domestic debt? Right. They pay back to borrow again, in some sense, right? I think there's another reason. Is if the government defaults, who are they defaulting on? Their own citizens, right? The same people who can show up with guns and pitchforks. And I'm not exaggerating about that. I mean, the country nowadays that is kind of, when you think of sovereign debt crises and defaulting on your sovereign debt, you think of Argentina, right? Argentina has defaulted, since 2000, they've defaulted 4 times on their government debt, right? Argentina has recently just had this long history of defaulting on its debt. But when I was in Argentina about 10 years ago, you actually went to the central bank. The central bank is kind of like right in the middle of Argentina, Buenos Aires, and you can actually see the bullet holes in the walls, right, where people have rioted and taken pot shots at the central bank, right? Because, yeah, you know, it's the citizens who hold this debt, and when you default on that debt, you're really ruining the wealth of citizens, and they could take to the streets. And then you have foreign debt. And what's foreign debt? Right, denominated in foreign currencies. Okay. Why would a country issue foreign debt? Right, exactly. Particularly for if you think about poor countries with not very well developed financial markets, right? So they simply may not be able to raise enough money in the domestic markets. And so this really gives them access to global markets. Of course, global markets don't want, to pick an example, they don't want Botswana Pula, right? So Botswana wants to borrow some money. Nobody wants to lend money to Botswana in Pula, right? But they might lend it in dollars. And so Botswana, most Botswana banks, the Botswana government, if they want to borrow, most likely it's going to be through foreign debt. I mean, they have a small domestic debt market too, but for the most part, they're borrowing in dollars, right? Of course, there's an extra risk here, right? This really exposes the government to a lot of exchange rate risk. Because what happens if the value of their currency collapses relative to the dollar? Well, then they, in real terms, they really end up owing a lot more, right? They're going to have to spend a lot more in their domestic currency to get those dollars to pay back their debt. Why do countries pay back foreign debt? In general, foreigners hold it. Why don't we just screw the foreigners? Right. So one reason you pay back is just like before, to borrow again. Is there any other avenue to make a country pay back its foreign debt? Well, so this is tricky. This is tricky. In the old days, we just go to war, right? And I'm not exaggerating about this, right? So England actually invaded Egypt in the early 1900s because basically in making the Suez Canal, Egypt borrowed all this money. A lot of it was from England in foreign bonds. Then Egypt said, we're not going to pay it back. And so England said, yes, you are. And they invaded the country, right? So in the old days, defaulting on your foreign bonds could lead the war. Thankfully, that doesn't happen so much directly, right? Not physical war, but what kind of war might you be sparking if you don't pay back your debt? Go ahead.
Trade war, maybe?
Could be a trade war. Yeah, I could. I mean, I can't think of any examples. Well, not directly. Oftentimes, and this is what this article in China will get at, it is possible that you can try to freeze foreign assets. And often this is done through what are called vulture capitalists. So in practice, the international law on getting you to pay your debt is pretty weak. It's not like in the US where, you know, if you default on a bond, there's pretty strict law about what you can do and what you can't do. International law is pretty weak, but there is some law, right? And particularly in different countries, there's different laws. And so there are financiers, these vulture capitalists, and basically this article is kind of talking about some of these vulture capitalists. What's a vulture capitalist? They basically live off the carcasses of bonds that have been defaulted or in danger of default. And so what do? In the case of Argentina, they've actually managed in many countries to freeze Argentina's assets. And they've been able to do this to such an extent that Argentina's president, the last I heard, was only flying commercial airplanes, not the government's plane, because worried that if you landed the government's plane in France, for instance, the plane could get seized. So, you know, really, in many ways, what they tried to be is they tried to be nuisances, right? Tried to make life so uncomfortable that the government in the end will give them some money. Maybe not the whole thing, but give them some money. And so these vulture capitalists tend to buy up these bonds. This is definitely what's happening here, right, with China, right? These are Chinese bonds from the 1940s, right, before the communist government. When the communist government came into power, they essentially defaulted on the previous government's bonds, and they said, that's it. And then some vulture capitalists have come in and they said, well, you know, I'm going to buy these bonds for a couple of cents, and then I'm going to see if I can put the squeeze on the Chinese government to get some money out of it, right? Will it work? Maybe, maybe not, right? But, you know, that's what a lot of these vulture capitalists do. It's a horrible system, quite honestly, right? It would be better if we had better international law to handle these things, but we don't, right? One of the reasons why vulture capitalists have become more popular is, as we're going to talk about, that I'll put this up here, but there's a coordination failure here. That's at the heart, particularly of foreign debt. Which is, you have to get every single bondholder to agree if you decide that you're going to, for instance, renegotiate your debt. So what has often happened, and this is what's happened to Argentina, is Argentina has basically said, we're going to default on our debt, we can't pay it back, but we'll give you 60 cents on the dollar, okay? It's called taking a haircut. And we'll talk about why people, well, you probably already know. Why would a bondholder take a haircut on their bond? Why would they take 60 cents on the dollar? It's better than nothing, right? And I think we've talked about this. One of the things that most financial people are good at is taking their losses, right? Well, I'll take my loss, I get out. So Argentina's offered these deals. 90% of the bondholders say, good deal, give me my money, I'm out. What about the other 10%? They stick around and make life miserable, right? They stick around and make life miserable. And that's essentially coordination failure, right? It would be nice if there was a way, like for domestic debt, where you can essentially force all bondholders to take the same deal, right? Under bankruptcy law, you can force every bondholder to take the same deal, right? But you can't do that so much on domestic debt. And so it's very messy. It's kind of ugly, right? Now, of course, these venture capitalists say, just because a government changes hands, that doesn't mean that you don't owe me money, right? I mean, I'm sure that's the argument of these venture capitalists is, listen, China's still China. You might have another government, but China's still government. China's still China, pay me my money. Yeah, I don't know. That doesn't seem to be too plausible of an argument to me, but the main thing is that this is really kind of an ugly system. It's not a very efficient system, right? But that said, foreign debt is the main way that many countries, particularly poor countries, default. debt crises have been common throughout history, right? For instance, countries that we don't think of as debt crisis defaulters, like France. France has actually defaulted on its debt 8 times, right? Now, they haven't done it since 1800, but between 1500 and 1800, they defaulted on their debt 8 times. Spain's done it 7 times before 1900. Nigeria 5 times since 1960. As I said, Argentina's done it 4 times since the year 2000. So some countries are serial defaulters, and debt crises are common, right? They're definitely fairly common. So how are we supposed to understand when a crisis takes place, and then what happens as a result of the crisis, and then how do you get past it? Well, to understand why a crisis takes place, probably the easiest way to understand sovereign debt crises is to look at something called the net transfer equation. Okay, just a simple equation. How much net revenue does the government get from its debt? All right, how much net revenue does the government get from its debt? That's the net transfer. And the net transfer is just equal to G minus R times D. D is your level of debt. Little g is the growth rate of debt. And R is the interest rate on debt. Okay? So this equation is pretty intuitive, right? What happens if G is greater than R? What's going to be true about the net transfer? In other words, the net revenue that the government gets from its debt. Going to be positive, right? So in other words, if the government's issuing more debt than it costs to pay for that debt, then the government gets some net positive revenue from it. But what happens if G becomes less than R? In other words, what happens if the government can't issue any new debt anymore? Yeah, then this could be a drain on the government's budget. And so this is, understanding this equation really is kind of the script for what a sovereign debt crisis looks like. Okay. So stage number 1, the boom, right? Government finds it's pretty easy to raise money, so it lends a lot. And this borrowing boom leads to a big increase in the debt, the level of debt. Then there's stage number 2. And stage number 2 is the bust, the crisis. And how does the stage number 2 usually take place? Well, there's a loss of confidence. The market gets spooked. Maybe it's because economic conditions decline in the country. Maybe because there's some other sort of economic crisis going on. Maybe there's a political crisis, right? We're going to kind of talk about some of these things here in a minute. But there's some sort of loss of confidence. What happens when markets lose confidence? What's going to happen to G? G is going to drop. Markets are going to stop lending. And what's going to happen to the yields? What's going to happen to interest rates? They go up. So markets are going to demand higher interest rates. They're going to lend less money. What happens to that net transfer? And now government can't make its debt payments. Because they have no source of liquidity, right? They're not able to borrow money. In fact, their debt is becoming a drain on their resources. And often, this takes place in the phrase I used is a sudden stop, right? Meaning, oftentimes it's not like markets kind of gradually lose confidence and you kind of ease into it. It's much more dramatic, right? Usually there's some piece of information and markets panic, right? And this loss of confidence in many ways is self-fulfilling. If enough people think there's going to be a sovereign debt crisis, what happens? There's a sovereign debt crisis. When does this sudden stop occur? Is it when a country gets a debt to GDP ratio of 100%? 150%? 200%? What's the number? Exactly. There is no number, right? In other words, there's no magic time at which this happens. It all depends upon debt tolerance. Basically, market confidence. How much confidence does the market have that you are going to repay your debt? So it is a completely subjective thing, right? Definitely, it's a completely subjective thing. Well, not completely, but fairly subjective. And what goes into this, a whole bunch of things, right? I mean, you tell me, what kind of things do you think goes into a market's confidence in a country's ability to repay? History. Have they repaid before? Alexander Hamilton, argued that the federal government had to assume the debts of the states and pay them, even though many people were arguing, no. What the federal government should do is let the states just kind of default on their debt, and we'll just start over. We're a new country, right? And Hamilton said, no, we have to have market confidence. We want to establish the idea in lenders' minds that we pay our debts, right? That's how we have a good financial system. And so, yes, some places have a history of repaying their debts. Other places don't. Today, Japan has a debt to GDP ratio of about 240%, highest in the world. Are they in any danger of having a debt crisis? I don't see it. Why? Markets think that we're paying. It's as simple as that, in part because they have history of it. What else? What else figures into this, do you think? Well, you might want to repay, but then there's the question of, can you repay, right? So you also have to look at the economic stability of a place, right? What's growth look like? What's their financial system look like? Some countries might want to pay, but they just simply can't. And then there's a question of, politics. Could the country go through a revolution or a coup? Or could the politicians just decide we don't want to pay our debt? So there's a lot that goes in here to this, right? I mean, market confidence and debt tolerance is a multifaceted thing. One final thing that definitely figures into is the problem one of insolvency or illiquidity? That also greatly figures into how much tolerance the market's going to have. What's the difference between insolvency and illiquidity? Sure.
Insolvency is not being able to pay your debts, and then illiquidity is like not having enough liquid assets to pay your debts.
Right. And I think another way you could say that is insolvency is a long-term problem, right? You simply do not have enough assets to pay your debts. Illiquidity is more of a problem of not having the right kind of assets, right? And it's more of a short-term problem. And so markets, whenever a country gets into trouble, markets will definitely ask themselves, is this one of insolvency or illiquidity? And so we're going to talk about the European debt crisis here in a couple minutes. And we're going to see that it played out much different in Greece than it did in Ireland. And part of the reason was, in Greece, the basic problem was insolvency. And that's a much bigger problem. In Ireland, it was more of a problem of illiquidity, which is not great to have, but the long-term prospects of Ireland were a lot better than the long-term prospects of Greece. And that still remains to be the case, right? So anyway, so just to make this point that, you just can't look at the level of debt and figure out the chance of a debt crisis. Most debt crises occur when debt to GDP levels are less than 40%. Meaning most debt crises occur actually at pretty low levels of debt. Why? Because most debt crises occur for countries that don't have any debt tolerance, that simply aren't able or aren't willing to repay their debt, right? So usually, this kind of sounds backwards, but when a country has a debt to GDP ratio of 100% or 150%, it probably means they're less likely to have a debt crisis because markets actually believe they're less likely, right? Having a lot of debt, strangely enough, might be a sign that you're less likely to have a debt crisis, right, than more likely. Okay, what happens when you have a debt crisis? Well, these are not mutually exclusive. Usually countries are going to do some combination of different things. So let's just kind of walk through the options. One is you can just repudiate. What's the problem with this?
It's harder to borrow in the future and current holders of debt can get angry.
Exactly, right? So it's going to be harder to borrow in the future, and the current owners of the debt are going to be angry. And if they're domestic, that might mean they're rioting in the streets. And if they're foreigners, that might mean that they're trying to freeze your assets, right? And try to harass you. So it's not a great option, right? Quite honestly, it's not a great option. And I think judging on how countries respond to a sovereign debt crisis, this is probably the worst option, right? I mean, usually this is the option after everything else has been exhausted. Much closer to the first option is to reschedule your debt. And this usually involves a couple of things. In part, it means asking bondholders to take a haircut. So when Greece was in trouble, in danger of defaulting on its debt, it basically asked its bondholders to take a 50% haircut, right? And that's not uncommon. 50, 60% is pretty reasonable number for most countries when they get in problem. They oftentimes will increase the maturities, right? So they'll say, well, those 5-year bonds, we're going to stretch them into 10-year bonds, right? Give me more time to repay the money back. What's the problem with doing this, though? We talked about this a minute ago. Less trade?
I said less trade in the investors that wouldn't want to invest in the country if they're stretching out bonds and offering them.
Well, I mean, that's probably true, right? Though on the flip side, if your choice is between repudiation and rescheduling, investors are going to be much happier if a country tries to reschedule than if they just say, forget it, I'm not paying.
Coordination failure?
It's that coordination failure problem again. You can get most bondholders to agree to this, but most likely there's going to be a few that don't. And then you spend years and years fighting with them. I mean, honestly, it takes a lot to be sympathetic for countries like Argentina, who've been badly managed and have done some incredibly stupid things economically. But yeah, I actually, in many ways, feel sorry for Argentina, right? Because I think particularly recently, they've tried to do a good faith effort to try to reschedule their debt and get this past them. But some bondholders are just plain and simple. They're going to try to hold Argentina over the fire and squeeze them and make life miserable for them, right? And I mean, it's very inefficient. And basically, who really loses there is other bondholders, right? They're really screwing other bondholders, right? who might be able to get more of their money back. Except sometimes countries don't reschedule because they know that not everybody will accept it. All right, you can also conduct austerity. And austerity basically means you try to cut your borrowing by cutting spending and raise taxes to reduce your debt. In other words, cut your way out of the crisis. Okay, this one is very understandable in the sense that, yeah, that makes sense. If a country is spending too much and it's got too much debt, how do you get your way out of it? Well, you should spend less, right? Here, we kind of think about countries like individuals, right? So if your credit card balance is too big, how do you get yourself under control? You spend less, right? And so many people want to kind of apply the same logic to an individual that is applied to the country. The problem is the same logic doesn't hold. Because what happens if the country as a whole spends less? What happens if a government goes out there and starts cutting spending and raising taxes?
The economic situation becomes more unstable.
Exactly, right? Right? So in many ways, if you think about this, this is the exact opposite of what the United States has done, has the ability to do, because we can borrow, right? During recessions, actually in the United States, we're always borrowing, but we tend to borrow more during a recession. And that helps smooth things out. But here, what you're really asking the country to do is to make things worse. You're asking them to cut spending and raise taxes right when the economy is in trouble. And so you're trying to basically cut your way to prosperity. And I think the bulk of the evidence is it just doesn't work, right? You can't get the debt situation under control when all you're asking the government to do is spend less and raise taxes and slow down economic activity, right? And so this one, it makes sense in the sense that it sounds pretty intuitive. It sounds intuitive to us because we're essentially treating the government like an individual, right? And this is, of course, one of the things that just, always drives me crazy as an economist. I have to say, we're in politics season. But whenever I hear a politician say, well, I have a budget and my company has a budget, so why doesn't the government follow a budget? That is a stupid statement, all right? Because you are you, your company is your company, and the government is the government, right? And so that's the fallacy of composition, right? What's true for an individual is not true for everybody. If everybody is forced to save, when I'm in trouble economically, if I save more, that's a good thing. But if everybody tries to save more, that's a bad thing, all right? And so that's the problem. That's the problem. How do we avoid this austerity? Well, oftentimes what governments will try to do is they'll try to get a bailout. Try to get a bailout or try to get a loan. From the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, which is an international organization that essentially is out there to help countries that have short-term problems, provide them with liquidity, or from other countries. As we're going to see in a minute, Greece got loans from the European Union, which basically means Germany. Okay. Of course, to get these loans, what do you usually have to do? If the IMF is going to make you a loan, in the past, what do they usually ask you to do? They're going to ask you to do 2 or 3. So for instance, in the past, the IMF has often asked countries to undertake austerity to get a loan. And that's something that I think a lot of economists really have questioned here over the last few years, right? Does this really make sense? As I said, we're going to talk about the European debt crisis, but I have to say, now that the European debt crisis, which is still kind of ongoing, right? It's been more than 10 years, it's still out there. Greece is still in trouble. But one of the reasons why Europe has just never really been able to put this past them is that Greece can't put this past them because Greece continues to need to bail out. And what does, in particular, Germany continue to ask Greece to do? Austerity. And so with more austerity, the Greek economy suffers. It can't raise enough money, so it needs another bailout. To get another bailout, what does Germany ask them? To do more austerity. It's just a vicious circle, right? It's just a vicious circle, one that they cannot break out of. Now, there is one option, one more option. And this one is only for domestic debt. But what's your domestic debt payable in? Domestic currency. What can you do? You can print more money. You can monetize your domestic debt by printing more money. But what's going to be the consequence of this? Right. And sometimes hyperinflation. All right, we'll talk about hyperinflation a little bit later in the class. I won't say much about it now, but all hyperinflations are associated with sovereign debt crises, right? They're basically the consequence of sovereign debt crises. When a country decides, I don't want to do these four things, and it's domestic debt, so I'm just going to print up money to pay my bills, right? And what you're really doing there is you're just kicking the can down the road. Because for some pretty obvious reasons, this is going to destroy your monetary system and destroy your financial system. So I'll get your question here in 1 second. But just to give you an example of how much this can destroy your financial system. Any guesses? You took $1 million and deposited it in an Argentinian bank, converted it to pesos there. And then today you converted it back to dollars. How much is it worth? Oh, you wish. It's gone. It's gone. Inflation has eaten away at the value of that. And so you can see how this has just destroyed the Argentinian financial system, right? Who's going to put their money in an Argentinian bank? Because this is essentially what Argentina forced many depositors to do, right? In the 1980s, many people had deposited dollars in Argentinian banks, and the government forcibly converted it to pesos, and then refused to let them withdraw it. That money was gone. They could have just gone and stolen it. It would have been simpler, right? Because that money was gone. As inflation went up to 200, 300, 400% a year, it all disappeared, right? So that's how you destroy a financial system. And so, hyperinflation, it seems to be easy in the short run, but in the long run, it's pretty disastrous. Do you have a question? Well, yeah, so almost all of the US debt is domestic debt, right? Even if foreigners hold it, that's not what makes it foreign debt, right? It's being denominated in a foreign currency. So yeah, I mean, in theory, the US government could pretty much get rid of its debt tomorrow if it wanted, if it just greatly increased the money supply. So this is an option that's available to the US government, right? Now, markets don't think the US government's going to do it, right? Why? And a lot of this gets back to debt tolerance, right? And so that's actually something we could put in there with debt tolerance, right? If part of debt tolerance is a trust that the government's not just going to print up money to pay its bills. But, you know, who knows in the future, right? Who knows in the future? I can't say that it's 0% possibility, right? But I think it's unlikely. And once again, that's just based on our country and our institutions and our political system, et cetera. But yeah, I mean, the US government does have this incredible ability. And I'll say, there are many people out there, reasonable people, who say this is one of the reasons why the US should increase inflation, even just a little bit, right? So our inflation rate over the last 10 years has been down closer to 1 or 1.5% a year. And so many reasonable people say, we have this debt out there. One way you can deal with the debt is let's just increase inflation to 2.5%. That will eat away at it pretty significantly over time. Yeah, but of course that has costs, right? That has other costs. So it doesn't have to be a hyperinflation. I've kind of put this in the most extreme example. But listen, if you have a debt crisis, increasing your inflation rate by 1% is not going to help much, right? I mean, you really have to be increasing it by a lot to help. What are the consequences of a debt crisis? What do we worry about this? Well, we worry about this because it's usually fairly disastrous. Usually fairly disastrous. You tend to have a big recession. And they get big increases in unemployment, increase in credit rationing, increase in interest rates, and you usually get a banking crisis. Let's talk about this for a second. Does a banking crisis lead to a sovereign debt crisis? Or does a sovereign debt crisis lead to a banking crisis? Does a banking crisis lead to a sovereign debt crisis? Or does a sovereign debt crisis lead to a banking crisis? Which one is it? Both. Right? This can work either way. Right? This can work either way. How does a sovereign debt crisis lead to a banking crisis? How could a sovereign debt crisis lead to a banking crisis? Well, yeah, it could be, yeah, maybe, but I think there's a much more direct link. Right. Exactly, banks hold bonds, right? Banks hold government bonds. So defaults lead to huge losses for banks that can trigger a banking crisis. Now, maybe this one's a little bit less obvious, but I think it's still pretty obvious. How could a banking crisis lead to a sovereign debt crisis? Yeah, I can't say that's wrong. I think that does happen. Yeah, I think that does happen. I think there's maybe a more direct way though. If you have a banking crisis, banks fail, what's that usually going to necessitate? A bank bailout. And who has to pay for the bailout? The government, right? And we're going to see that in a minute here, we're going to talk about an example of both of these. This is the example of what happened in Greece, where a sovereign debt crisis led to a banking crisis. This is what happened in Ireland, where a banking crisis led to a sovereign debt crisis. Okay. So let's talk here about the European debt crisis, because I think it's just talking about a specific example helps us kind of conceptualize this a lot better, right? Gives us some kind of framework to think about all these things. Okay. So the European debt crisis really began in 2009. And in some sense, it's still going on today. Okay. So, you know, the ramifications of this still are long lasting. In fact, you know, if you open up The Economist every week, pretty much there's an article about what's going on today, right? With Greece and with Germany and with the, you know, the sovereign debt crisis, et cetera. But really where this crisis began is it began way back in 1999. With the European Monetary Union. This was the creation of the single currency, the euro. And the Maastricht Treaty. Maastricht is you might have heard of it, a city in Belgium. I believe it's Belgium, yeah, Belgium. And so that's where this kind of big treaty came together between countries who wanted to participate in the euro. And so what the Maastricht Treaty did is it laid out all the criteria that countries had to meet to join the euro, what is called the convergence criteria. So that here's the idea, which I think should be pretty intuitive. We can't have countries on one currency, but have much different interest rates, right? If we're going to get every country on one currency, we have to converge our financial markets. And so we need to make sure that countries have similar interest rates, similar inflation rates. They have to have similar debt levels, right? We have to get our countries together more before we can move to one currency. Because if we don't, there's going to be chaos, right? I mean, how could you have a system in which the euro, if you borrow euros in Germany, it's 1%, and you borrow euros in Greece, it's 5%. Like, that doesn't make any sense, right? So we need to get our financial systems to converge in order to move to a single currency. And so that's what the convergence criteria was. And I'll just write the 4 big ones. Interest rates had to be within 2% of the lowest interest rate country. And whenever I say lowest country here, who am I talking about? Germany. Because Germany is the most financially conservative country, really among rich countries in the world, right? It has some of the lowest interest rates, it has some of the lowest debt levels, it has some of the lowest inflation rates. So this is really saying interest rates had to be within 2% of Germany's. Inflation had to be within 1.5% of the lowest country. You had to get your debt to GDP ratio down to 60%, less than 60%. And you had to have your deficit to GDP, meaning how much you borrow every year, less than 3%. Okay. So that's what countries had to do. And so what did countries do? They tried to meet this. And as we're going to see here, some countries just barely made it. Just barely made it. So here's looking at interest rates in these different countries, right? Greece, Ireland, Italy, Portugal, Spain, Germany, right? Some of the big European Union countries. And notice here, did interest rates converge? Yeah, they did. They definitely did. Look at Greece here. Greece had, going back to 1990, had interest rates of upwards of 30%, right? Germany is down here, much lower, 10%. And what we see is over this period of time, there's a lot of convergence. And Greece just barely slid in. Just barely slid in, but there was definitely convergence, right? There's definitely convergence. What if you look at the deficit as a percent of GDP? Once again, you see a fair amount of convergence, though there's still a lot of diversity here at the end. Countries definitely converged, okay? However, this seemed to work, right? But there were some fundamental problems with the way that this was set up. And the fundamental problem is that all of these rules only apply to get into the European Union. What happened when you were in? Then there's no rules, right? And so in hindsight, that's pretty clearly, and I shouldn't say in hindsight, I think a lot of economists at the time were kind of shocked by this. So there were clearly no restrictions there were no enforcement mechanism. I guess that's probably a better way of saying it. There's no way to enforce good behavior. There was no ability for stabilization policy. For instance, the European Central Bank, right? It is not set up to be a lender of last resort in any meaningful way, not like the Federal Reserve. Basically, we'll talk more about this tomorrow, but the main goal of the European Central Bank is to keep inflation at 2%. That's it. That's really all they're charged with. And so that doesn't really give them a lot of flexibility to respond to any crisis. And then finally, there was no, for lack of a better word, prenuptial agreement. Meaning, if this is not working, how do you kick out a country? Not clear, right? Not clear at all. Right? Not clear at all. And so in hindsight, this was a pretty flawed system, right? And so what happened in the early days of the European Monetary Union? Well, think about that graph that I showed you up there. Now, in the early days, Greece is borrowing at pretty much the same interest rate as Germany. What's the problem with that? The Greeks are Greeks and the Germans are Germans, right? When Germans can borrow at low interest rates, what do? They generally don't borrow. When Greeks can borrow at low interest rates, what do? Go nuts. And that is essentially what happened, right? So there's a lot to be said here, but I'm just going to give you the Cliff Notes version. Remember, I said this yesterday. Greece is about the size of Minnesota's economy. It's not a huge economy. But here they had this small economy, had this ability to essentially borrow immense amounts of money because there was a lot of interest in holding euro bonds denominated in euros, right? The thinking was that the euro was going to be a competitor to the US dollar. And so, yeah, let me hold a lot of euro assets. A bond from Greece? Sure, looks great. And so little Greece was able to borrow like crazy. This was in a country that had a hugely inefficient economy, right? In Greece, before the crisis, about 40% of income went untaxed, right? So there's a lot of tax avoidance, that people just don't pay their income taxes. In Greece, you could retire, if you're a man, you could retire at the age of 50 in Greece and get a full pension from the government. Unemployment was 30%. And in this very inefficient economy with very low growth, the government basically borrowed like crazy, right? And over a short period of time, essentially borrowed the equivalent of $250,000 per person in Greece, right? Just to give you some idea of what the huge debt run-up was. What was the thing that triggered the crisis? Well, actually what triggered the crisis was just better information. In 2009, there was an election in Greece, and the new party came into office, and the new party looked at the books and they said, you know how the previous government said that our deficit to GDP would be 6%? The government said our deficit to GDP is going to be 6%. Well, we just looked at the books and it's really 12%. And markets went nuts, as you can imagine. It ended up being 18%, right? So it's even worse than the new government thought. And so there was just panic, sudden stop, right? I mean, all of a sudden, Greece could not borrow any more money. They could not roll over their debt. That's bad for Greece, but pretty quickly, everybody else in Europe figured out this is bad for them too, because who were some of the big holders of those Greek bonds? European banks and European citizens, right? Particularly German banks and German citizens. And so, what's been the kind of the Cliff Notes version of how this has worked out over the last 10 years? Well, Greece got a bailout from the European Union and from the IMF, but in return for this bailout, they've asked for very, very strict austerity. What impact has this austerity had on the Greek economy? It's been pretty devastating. So the Greek economy doesn't grow and unemployment just stays very high. And so Greece can't pay back its debts. So it haggles with the European Union, basically Germany. Germany says, you're going to pay back your debts. This time we're really going to let you default. You're going to pay back, you're going to pay back. And then it gets to the 12th hour and they're like, okay, we'll give you a loan, but you just have to promise more austerity. Greece says, okay, sure, more austerity, right? And they don't follow through, or they do and it makes the economy worse. And it's just this horrible cycle, right? If you listen to the Germans act like, oh, this is so hard for us. We're so good. We're giving so much money to these deadbeat Greeks, but not really, right? I mean, who has a lot to lose in this? The Germans do. They're not doing this out of the goodness of their heart, right? They're really doing this because they're forced to economically. And so the fact that Greece, let me put this another way. I think I said yesterday, what's true about the best bailouts? They are quick and they're overwhelming, right? You just end the crisis, you take your medicine. Germany has been unable to take its medicine. And as a result, it's just stretched this out year after year after year after year. And it's really ruined a lot of Europe, including, has done a huge amount of damage to Greece in particular, right? So just a lot of this back and forth brinksmanship that in hindsight isn't, the politics of it are one thing, but from an economic perspective, it's been pretty ugly to watch. What did the European Central Bank do during most of this? Not much, because they couldn't. About 4 years into the crisis, member countries did allow the European Central Bank to do some buying of this debt. So to basically do some quantitative easing. This is what we called it in the US, right? Where the central bank bought a lot of this debt. But along this whole time, it's been too little too late, right? And that's probably, I guess if you were going to give the European debt crisis a title, you would call it too little too late, right? Because that's basically been the entire response to this. Just very briefly, I want to talk about Ireland, because Ireland also was part of the European Monetary Union and had a sovereign debt crisis here. But the interesting thing is Ireland's problem is almost completely separate from what happened in Greece. Ireland's problem, as I said, was a completely different set of problems. Ireland's problem, right, was they had a housing bubble, just like the United States. There was a lot of bank deregulation in Ireland, a huge bank deregulation. And so Irish banks got into the mortgage-backed security business. they also got very heavily in the US mortgage-backed security business. Right. So there's some very darkly humorous stories about what happened in Ireland in the run up to this. You know, there was so much bank deregulation in Ireland that basically within a generation, there were a lot of people in Ireland that moved from becoming potato farmers to bankers. And these may not have been the most savvy of people, right? And so the story on Wall Street was that on Wall Street, people knew, a lot of people on the inside knew that a crisis was coming. And so a lot of the sharper investment banks unloaded their mortgage-backed security holdings before the crisis, or unloaded a lot of them. And so who did they unload them on? Well, first they tried to unload them on some of the dumber American banks. And then that process kind of dried up. So then they tried to go to the next stupidest people they could think of, which was the Germans. And they unloaded some of them on the Germans. And then when that kind of dried up, where did they go to? They went to the Irish, right? And I mean, that's a very cynical thing, but the thinking was the Irish are not sophisticated about this, right? They're just not. They haven't been in the business. And I think, unfortunately, that proved to be true, right? That a lot of these Irish banks just made some deals that just are unbelievably stupid, right? Unbelievably stupid. And so when the US had its own housing crash, housing prices fell by about 30%. And what happened to all these mortgage-backed securities? Trash, right? Defaulting. They had a banking crisis. Now, what did the Irish government do? The Irish government was so worried about the collapse of the entire economy. The Irish government gave one of the most generous bailouts in the history of economics. Basically, the Irish government said, we are going to bail out banks, we're going to bail out bondholders, we're going to bail out depositors, we're going to bail out everybody. Not too smart, right? I mean, yes, there probably needed to be some bailout, but by not making anybody take some losses, not only did this lead to a bad precedent, but this was incredibly expensive. In 2009, Ireland's deficit, the deficit, meaning how much they borrowed in 1 year, was 32% of GDP. That's huge, huge. And what did this do? Spark the sovereign debt crisis. When bond markets basically saw how much the Irish government was going to borrow, they're like, no way, I'm out, right? No way. And so this is an example of how a banking crisis can spark a sovereign debt crisis, right? It can work opposite. The difference, and why you're probably not nearly as familiar with Ireland as you are with Greece, is that while this was bad for Ireland, it wasn't the tragedy that happened in Greece for a couple of reasons. First off, the Irish economy was in a much better shape than the Greek economy, right? Fundamentally, Ireland was a good economy, right? Strong growth, low unemployment, it's a well-run economy. The problem here was one of illiquidity, right? Markets freaked out because they needed to borrow so much money so fast. But in terms of their ability to pay this money back, I think markets actually have some fundamental trust that the Irish economy is strong enough to pay the money back. And so Ireland got a bailout from the IMF and from other European Union countries, and it actually recovered fairly quickly. Right? It went through a severe recession, but that recession ended by end of 2010, and Ireland got through this. Right? Ireland got through this. So it's a good example of how, a sovereign debt crisis does not have to be the end of your country, right? But it helps a lot if you have a strong government, a strong economy, and you're able to get a bailout, right? And those are three things that Greece has never had, right? They've never had a strong government, they didn't have a strong economy, and they've never been able to get the kind of bailout that they really need to get past their problems, right? That the fact that they just keep on getting strung along with a little bit has really made it impossible for them to kind of put things behind them. So, is the US going to have a debt crisis? You read that article about US Treasuries, right? Prices up, yields down, people jumping into the Treasury market. One thing that article didn't have is that since that article was published in January, the government's borrowed about $2 trillion more because of the COVID. Are we going to have a debt crisis? Becca, you say no because you're an optimist? I'm sorry, Dave. So you think that we could have a debt crisis? Mm-hmm. That seems pretty negative. Anybody less negative? More negative? What do you think, Natalie?
Well, I just think with COVID still being around and the election, this election year, and the policies that each candidate was in office, so that increase deficit even more. But they could do the next couple of years could see potential rise.
Wow, you guys you're pessimists, deeply pessimists. Well, what do you think?
I don't think so. I think that the market's pretty confident in the US. I mean, we've run a deficit for I don't know how many years in a row.
Mm-hmm.
Other countries are used to us all the time.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you've seen during COVID is, this is somewhat counterintuitive, but the worse that the US economy does, the stupider that the US government is during COVID, the more attractive it makes government debt. Strangely enough, right? Like, even though the government's borrowed all this money, and even though the government's response to COVID has been fairly incompetent, the fact of the matter is everything in finance is relative, right? Everything in finance is relative. So, yeah, has the risk of Treasury debt gone up? I think so. But has it gone up relative to every other kind of debt? Maybe not. I mean, corporate debt looks more risky, right? Municipal bonds look more risky. A lot of foreign countries have debt has gotten more risky. So money needs to go somewhere, right? Money needs to go somewhere. And risk is all relative. And so, yes, right, the US government has borrowed a lot of money. But I think it's also true the US government still has a lot of debt tolerance. And money's got to go somewhere, right? Money's got to go somewhere. And so I would say, to me, that could be the title of that article that you talked about, is money's got to go somewhere, right? Americans are saving more, foreigners are saving more, corporations are saving more, right? So with all this savings, it's got to go somewhere. And treasury bills and treasury bonds still look pretty good to markets. And you know, it's hard to argue that, because I don't really know where, if you have money, where you're going to put it that's less risky, right? There's just not very many good options for that. I mean, I guess there's always the option of digging a hole in your yard and putting money in there, but that's got some risks associated with it too, right? So anyway, yeah, it's just kind of, yeah, I won't tell this story, but I will tell the story very quickly. I have some friends who, so he's both of them are children of immigrants. One of them his parents were from Haiti. And so, you know, I think you want to talk about fear of government and fear of financial systems, right? You grow up in Haiti or have parents from Haiti, you have a real fear of financial systems. I went over to his house. He lived in New York, and I went over to his house one time, and when I walked in, the house was covered in $20 bills, just sitting around. I was like, what in the heck? He had $20 bills hanging from the ceilings, everything. I was like, what in the world's going on? Well, what had gone on is he was mistrustful of banks. And so he put his money in the wall, and then a pipe broke in his building. And all his savings, I think it was like $20,000 in 20s, got drenched, and they were starting to get mildewy. So he was trying to drive him out in his apartment, right? And so I only mentioned that, like, money's got to go somewhere, right? I mean, it's risky to put your money in the wall too. So, you know, with all that said, I think that's the tact of a lot of investors, right? Is that, you know, treasuries still look pretty good. But, you know, listen, it's hard to argue that treasuries on an absolute level aren't riskier, right? Because, yes, some of the things that have happened the last few years. And I think if you talk to people in markets, in particular, they very much worry about the political dysfunction, right? I mean, really important part of that tolerance is trusting a government's ability to behave competently and to do the right thing. And I think that's been shaken a lot the last few years, right? As the U.S. government has increasingly had a difficult time just not kicking ourselves in the face. So, all right, well, I better let you go. So this afternoon, we'll meet back here at 12:30, right? And we'll talk for about an hour about econometrics. So, all right, have a good lunch.